Who's Dr. Stinky McDougal?
You mean the legend?
He's a real buckaroo banzai kind of guy.
I watched him dice a guy into pieces with 6 f***ing words one time.
Stinky's the most inconvenient man in most rooms.
He's a master of drunk boxing.
Every time Stinky calls, my blood pressure skyrockets!
I heard he's staging an evolution.
Dr. Stinky McDougal says the difference between a revolution and an evolution is the conscious choice not to break everything in the transition.
And now, broadcasting from the borderless territory of Liberty Valley, Minnesota, here's your host, Dr. Stinky McDougal! Shake it, baby!
Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody to the first inaugural Dr. Stinky McDougal podcast. It is a podcast that seeks to unify cutting-edge ideas like the electric universe, ancient electrical civilizations, and all things paranormal. If you have someone you'd like me to reach out to for an interview, or if you'd like to be a future guest, just drop me a line at drstinky.mcdougal@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can make a connection. Today, I'd like to introduce the very first guest of the podcast, Troy McLachlan, who is broadcasting today from Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Troy is the originator, as one of two of the originators of the solar system formation model that first got my attention about 3 years ago, called a Herbig-Haro Object. The Herbig-Haro Object got my attention because it offered a really good electrical model for the solar system formation, and more importantly, it tied up very neatly for me how Venus got directly aligned with the planet Earth in the cataclysm. And in fact, part of the thesis of the Herbig-Haro object is that it collapses. And we'll talk about that as well. With that, welcome, Troy, to the Dr. Stinky McDougal inaugural podcast. Why don't you begin by sharing a little bit about yourself and maybe talk about what brought you to creating a new thesis on the solar system?
Yeah, well, I am the author of a book called The Saturn Death Cult. It was written basically as an attempt to provide a interplanetary oriented and natural context to some of the interpretive, distortions that you can find within sort of occult circles when it comes to world mythology and the mythical role played by the god Saturn. So essentially, the book tries to make the case that there's a deep-seated and often highly destructive archetypes that are recognized within the collective psyche of the human species, and that this originates from a series of relatively recent interplanetary cataclysms that were witnessed and recorded in mythology by humankind, basically at a time when the Earth's skies were very different from the skies that we see today. So hopefully the book that I wrote is an introduction to sort of electric universe principles to do with a thing called Saturn theory. It illustrates how the collective trauma suffered by humanity as a result of these destructive interplanetary episodes has since been exploited by various minority and what I would call elitist interest groups, right, intent on exercising control over broader human population and so on. And basically they're doing this as a way of trying to establish themselves as establish for themselves some kind of man-engineered new golden age that emulates the old golden age that was ruled over by the god Saturn of mythology, and what I would argue is also the planet Saturn. And of course, we're talking about that golden age that was lost as a result of these interplanetary cataclysms. This golden age is the one that's portrayed in world mythology as having been ruled over by this creator god archetype known as Saturn by the ancient Romans and by a host of other names in other cultures. And so naturally, if one is trying to tie in the cacophony of mythical dramas and catastrophes as being based on some chaotic and these observed movements of the planets that bear the names of mythology's various gods and pantheons of gods, then obviously one has to offer a cosmological model as to how the solar system of ancient times could have been so radically different to what we see today. And this is why I'm a proponent of a theory called Saturn theory, which seeks to explain how the planet Saturn was one and the same with the mythical god called Saturn, and how that planet once ruled the skies of Earth as a bright sun in its own right before its downfall in a great doomsday event about 6,000 years ago. Of course, Bob, for many people, this is probably the most preposterous aspect of Saturn theory, this concept of these interplanetary cataclysms happening in relatively recent times when humans inhabited the planet, and we're actually able to record these events into what is now known as a mythological record. We live in a world that's currently dominated by uniformitarian concepts of change over vast epochs of
very slowly
geological time and so on. So naturally people believe that the solar system in its current configuration has been around for billions of years. So the very idea of a highly destructive reconfiguration of the solar system, within collective human memory, it's a hard one for people to swallow. And so the Saturn theory, is generally called Saturn theory within electric universe circles, is an attempt to offer a model for an entirely new and radical reappraisal of solar system history, and why the ancient mythological record supports this. That's why it's important for authors like me to provide a model for how this might have happened. And I'm lucky enough to have come into contact with the works of people from the beginning of this kind of theorizing. Immanuel Velikovsky, a name that a lot of people know in these circles. Within electric universe circles, Eduardo Cardona, Dave Talbot, Well Thornhill. Both Cardona and Thornhill are no longer with us. And many others who pioneered Saturn theory and helped me formulate a more, my own, and these are my own ideas, along with what I worked out with a fellow author called Ted Holden, based on this sort of linear approach to planetary and solar system formation, which puts the emphasis on the capture model of planets. So I tend to follow Eduardo Cardona's hypothesis, which calls for the sun's recent capture of a brown dwarf star with at least 2 of its own terrestrial satellites in tow, later identified as Earth and Mars, and for the ejection of another celestial body from out of the core of this captured brown dwarf star that would later become the planet Venus. So you've got this 4-bodied system that would then be broken up with each of the now 3 terrestrial satellites of Earth, Mars, and Venus going their separate ways from the brown dwarf star to find new orbits around the sun, while the original brown dwarf star is burnt out and eventually becomes settled in orbit around the sun as the planet Saturn. But of course, the most crazy thing for most people is that this happened during not just human existence, but during the time when humans could record this stuff, for posterity and produce a mythological record.
One of the things that I've set up here for us, Troy, is I actually have the Ganymede hypothesis queued. So if it's all right, what I'm going to do is I am going to play about 2 minutes from the Ganymede hypothesis, which just introduces people to the idea, because I think it's just that important that people get a real sense of it.
According to electric universe principles, the protostar seen at the center of Herbig-Haro objects forms as the result of a Z-pinch taking place along an existing Birkeland current. This is actually a type of short-circuiting that is taking place, and not the result of gases imploding under their own weight to trigger nuclear fusion reactions. Most stars can be seen clearly placed along the filamentary strings of plasma that show up in enhanced space images. Subsequently, stars are to be understood as electrostatic phenomena according to the electric universe model, and a Birkeland current that undergoes a Z-pinch will produce this kind of effect along with powerfully attractive magnetic fields capable of sucking vast amounts of heavy elements into its core. The subsequent plasma beads seen forming further along both the north and south stretches of this Birkeland current are simply lesser Z-pinches, but are still areas capable of generating intense magnetic fields, and therefore able to also concentrate heavy element matter into their centers to form the kind of protocores needed to form planets and brown dwarf stars. As stated earlier, while it is not currently known what is inside these plasma beads, the authors of Cosmos and Collision believe protoplanets and proto-brown dwarfs can and are being created by this process. At some stage in the Herbig-Haro Object's life, the highly active Birkeland current that has formed the central protostar and the series of plasma beads along its length will break. When this happens, the protostar is electrically severed from the plasma beads seen along the length of its jets, and severed from any object that may have formed inside these plasma beads. The jets will disappear, effectively leaving a series of independent celestial objects strung out from each other along their original axis of spin. That is, a series of axially aligned celestial objects that will range from the main protostar at the center of the Herbig-Haro object to possible brown dwarfs, gas giant planets, and even terrestrial planetary bodies.
So I'm going to stop there because it's a good place to start. But you know what I really liked about that is that right at the end, Walt Thornhill actually did a video about the new James Webb images, and his whole point of the James Webb Telescope's new images of star formation is that you can see them forming very cleanly along the filamentary lines, as you pointed out years ago. And so this was one of the things that I went, hey, yeah, wait a minute. If we've got these long filaments of Birkeland currents out there, why would it not make sense that a Z-pinch is the originator of the inside of a star? And that idea, is that an idea that you originated, or where does that idea
No, that is very much Walt Thornhill's sort of work. Where we differ, I tend to follow as I said before, the Eduardo-Cardona concept of what they call the stick through a donut sort of idea, where he was looking for evidence to show observable evidence that shows linear formations in space rather than equatorial orbit formations, because the whole world is obsessed with the idea that planets form according to accretion disks, while the dust coalesces in orbit around a central star.
Why don't you take just a moment for folks and explain what the helical model is and what the weaknesses of it are?
Okay, so the accretion disk model idea of how the solar system formed is that you have a large disk of dust that forms around a protostar, and everything is held together by gravity. And over the process of time, the dust and the particles and the bits of silicate and rock and so on form into balls that ultimately form into different types of planets and produce solar systems as the star becomes main sequence, meaning like our star and so on. And these planets develop over time. Now, the major fault with that sort of a system is it doesn't explain the diversity of planets that we have in the solar system.
Do we have a model anywhere that's replicable, where you spin things in a circle and inside the circle other circles form? Has it been reproduced anywhere?
To even try and get the idea that gravity is formed by stuff that bangs into each other, gets bigger and bigger, and so on, and sticks. Even in their computer models, they've had to introduce a sticky element that they can't explain. So the electric universe is very simple. Static electricity is very sticky. And so electrical components can actually create, especially where the Z pinches, you call them Z pinches, don't you, in America? The Z pinch is used as as a part of the formation. But in their gravity-driven only model, everything acts like, in the computer models, it's very frustrating for them because everything acts like billiard balls and just basically
Yes.
bounces off each other. It never gets together, let alone forming diverse, massively different in makeup types of planets. Whether, you know, gas, even the terrestrial planets of our system are so different to each other.
Well, and then there's no dust cloud between us and the other planets. You know, as if there's a 100% uptake of,
Yes.
you know, there's this, you know, there's the asteroid belt, if you will, but you know, generally speaking, between the planets, you know, you don't have this dust still there. I mean, are we saying that 100% of the dust was taken up into the planets, and it just doesn't.
Well, they
make
would
sense.
claim 99%. There's still, you know, bits of dust out there that falls to Earth and so on like that you see it and so on. So there's no doubt that, you know, we can observe dust clouds around protostars and so on like that. They exist as a form of.
Are we sure that the stars aren't causing the dust cloud?
Again, to go back into trying to work out where the dust originally comes from, and so on. You know, you go back to sort of their Big Bang ideas, and such. It becomes so far into the past as to what actually created dust. Where the electric universe picks up is the nature of how that dust interacts with other dust and other objects that exist. So we can observe what's actually out there in space at the moment. And the electric universe model seeks to show the physics behind that based on electrical models, as opposed, you know, there's this filamentary plasma-based, where the fourth state of matter, plasma, is the major player in making dust do whatever it does, to either form into bodies or to not form into bodies, to go its own way. The rock guitarist Brian May is one of the actually the world's biggest mainstream proponents of you know, dust clouds and how that produces gravity in the universe and so on, from a mainstream point of view. The electric universe would challenge his ideas that dust coalesces until it forms enough gravity to get more dust and so on, the accretion disk model for planetary formation, even star formation. We would challenge that on the basis that what causes dust to coalesce is the nature of plasma, with the electrical currents, the highly electrically conductive currents through plasma acting on these dust clouds.
I've included, I'm screen sharing right now, the Z-Pinch JPEG that you sent over to me, that I, you know, as you look at this, you really get a sense of how the planet forms in the middle along the chord of the Birkeland current in that Z-Pinch. And you know, you can almost really see a planet right there forming along those filamentary cores.
Yeah, if there's material there, silicate or heavy, you know, metals, any kinds of you know, atomic particles, that kind of that there are of the elements that we know in the universe and so on. A Z-Pinch is going to draw that in, that stuff in sort of
just
relatively instantaneously.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you know, you know, kids have often seen at school demonstrated an old-fashioned soda can being crushed by a Z-Pinch. You know, and there's no sparks or anything like that. The power, though, that is there is so infinitely more, you know, apparent than anything that is caused by gravitational models.
Once the general public finally realizes, you know, how much real influence the Z-Pinch has on just the attraction of material. My favorite example of it is a magnet to water. You know, people have no idea that water is affected by a magnetic field, as is all matter. And so whether you think of something, you know, as unmagnetic as aluminum, it still doesn't really matter. In the dielectric world, it's going to be pulled towards a major electrical force, just like everything else.
Yeah. So to get back to what, you know, we were saying about Weil Thornhill, he and Eduardo Cardona, you know, jousted quite a lot over this idea of linear formations. Cardona was going towards the idea of protostars that have been formed in a Z-Pinch already, And what happens is that they then create these mainstream science calls them polar jets that come out either end, the northern pole of the protostar and the southern pole. And
so it starts in the middle and it shoots north and south.
Yeah, you get these jets that come out. Mainstream science will say that that's what you see with black holes. That you have these supposedly jet-like the supposedly jet-like activity that these objects produce. What you're actually seeing is the Z pinch, which is an electrical overload on one of these filamentary lines of plasma, and so on. So it's a short circuit, but it then creates its own kind of homopolar motor type circuit that. How can I put this way? People are led to believe that these jets are like a hose pipe shooting out material, the way a hose pipe shoots water across your garden, and so on. What we're actually seeing is plasma in glow mode, where there is a negative and a positive flow in and out that eventually turns round, like you see in a magnet, in a magnetic field. In basic, science experiments at school, where you see how the iron particles create that fanned hourglass look, and so on. So we're seeing the glow mode of the plasma involved in the electrical circuit generated by this protostar that was created by a Z pinch. And within that, those so-called jets that are just simply currents of electricity in glow mode, in terms of the plasma that's holding it together, you can also get secondary Z pinches, Z pinches. You can get secondary ones that may form, terrestrial objects, other gaseous objects, brown dwarf stars, possibly even stars that can become main sequence and binary. And eventually that current that the proto sun is putting out will collapse and sever the electrical connection between those secondary objects created in those so-called jets. And then you get a process of it collapsing into each other and being captured by the main protostar. Now, this is what Cardona was moving towards, and what I myself with TEDNAV sort of developed with this idea. Thornhill was not very favorable of this. He just preferred the idea of a filamentary process where a planetary system is created in situ, and the jets are just simply an electrical consequence of that system.
So the difference is that what you're saying is that the solar system essentially formed as a single congruent set, versus all of these things happen along the way, and then it just kind of happened to be the thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The Herbig-Haro object is a single, and I brought up a little screen shot of the video.
The stick in the donut.
Yeah, the stick in the donut. And what I like about this is that you've got your primary center, and then along that filament, you create a core, and it's like inside of its own little planetary set. It's, if you talk about the entire heliosphere of the sun, is that what we're talking about forming, is the heliosphere of the sun around that object?
Yes, absolutely. So the image that you've got in there, which the video doesn't quite go into that detail and so on, is like the little red dot at the center. That is not the star. That is its heliosphere. So if that was a model of what our solar system started off, which is what I'm attempting to show in the video.
Oh, okay.
All right. Okay. Then that little red dot there is the bubble holding the protostar that will become our sun at a later date. So if you imagine how large the heliosphere is at the moment, that's what that little red dot is. Now, the jets that produces, which, they show our sun produces jets even to this day. But those jets along there that you see, the electrical current is held in place by by the electrical circuit that protostar is generating, and within that stick, which can be filamentary in nature. It's not. The video is a little bit misleading in that it's perfectly straight.
Right? Okay, sure.
Okay, so things can get filamentary to a certain degree, but what's by that, for the audience, by that it can sort of crackle and pop, and it can bend and waver and so on along these lines. And of course, when that connection, that big long electrical connection, is broken, if a planetary body or a star that has formed as a result of a secondary Z-pinch along that stick is caught at a point in time where the filament has bent to, let's say, a 26-degree angle in relation to the north-south axial alignment of its protostar, then it will hold that the axial alignment, that whole system, whatever it is. And as a brown dwarf star, as I argue, it is now at a 26-degree orbit with its own planets, and it will form its own system that becomes a free-floating brown dwarf south of the protosun that birthed that giant electrical current. These are actually quite short-lived systems, Herbig-Haro objects. Now, I have to let people understand that nobody has yet seen inside one of these. They call them beads, these giant beads that you see along Herbig-Haro objects. And Herbig-Haro objects, they're seeing them all over the place, all over the galaxy with the telescopes that we have today. No one's seen inside one of these beads that forms, but the electric universe model would almost insist that a Z-pinch is taking place at that time. And, as a result of that, the idea that you get planetary formation inside these beads, and if you go back to that, think back to that image that you showed there, some of those beads can look like they're almost as big as the heliosphere of the proto-sun.
Sure.
So we're talking vast distances here. Those beads are not the planet themselves. They are the various planetary bodies' own heliospheres or plasmaspheres, plasma sheaths that they form around electrical fields with various objects that find themselves in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. One of the things that I found most fascinating about your model is that it acknowledged, outright, that not only did the planets form along the Birkeland current, but that the Birkeland current and the planets were moving in a single direction. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, they follow Hannes Alfvén's galactic electric galactic circuit or whatever. This is the whole idea that everything has a northerly progression, based on the electrical circuit that controls the galaxy. So people know, that the current solar system that we are in at the moment is not a flat disk spinning idly. It's actually a flat disk that there's traveling north. I think it's at 56,000, kilometers a second.
Yeah. We're not standing
northwards.
Still here in space by any stretch.
That's right. Yeah, but it follows along the arm. We're on the outer arm of a galaxy, and we're moving north is along that spiraled arm towards the center. And all we're doing is we're following the magnetic.
It's a current charge flow as well. It's we're being drawn electromagnetically. That's the major force causing it. But ultimately, the planet,
the magnetic line,
the magnetic line is being magnetism doesn't have a line. I had to learn this one. I made a lot of mistakes on this. So what we're following is the electricity of the line along the current. So the current, just like the current of a river, the planets are sitting along the river.
Yes.
I'm going to play just a moment of the video here towards the end where it talks about that and the collapse of the Herbig-Haro object.
Because all these bodies originally shared the same axial spin and direction of motion while joined by an active Birkeland current, they will continue to proceed through space in roughly the same direction, though at different speeds and increasingly different axial tilts. The protostar at the center of the Herbig-Haro object will now most likely travel fastest along its original celestial northerly course, where it will eventually catch up to any planetary body or brown dwarf that may have formed in the plasma beads of its northern jet. Upon catching up to these bodies, the protostar will force these planets or brown dwarfs into an orbital relationship with itself, something that may slow its northerly progress in the process. Any southerly planets or brown dwarfs formed in the protostar's southern plasma jet will, though severed from their protostar, also continue a northerly journey in the nominal slipstream of the protostar and, at a later date, also be captured by the protostar as they catch up to it, thanks to the protostar having been slowed by its previous capture of the northern bodies. In this way, a protostar formed at the center of a Herbig-Haro object is destined to collect to itself any celestial bodies previously formed by Z-pinches in its polar jets. The process of collecting these disparate bodies will be catastrophic and induce highly destructive changes in the electrical status of any planets or brown dwarf stars that form as a part of a Herbig-Haro object. Eventually, however, the process will see all the involved bodies electrically equalize and settle into a stable orbital configuration. Eventually.
So there we go. I just loved when I saw that part. I mean, I had been working on the Venus Cataclysm for some time, and I saw that I went, there you go. There is exactly how the collapse occurred. And the beauty is that I do a lot of work with mythology as well. And the mythology actually tells us where Earth and Mars were in relation to the protostar. Because in the mythology, when Mars is born, Mars drops down. Mm-hmm. And, so, every time I keep looking at the Herbig-Haro object design and why something like that would collapse, the mythology and most of the things that I look at in terms of other relatable references support not only the Herbig-Haro object, but the collapse of the Herbig-Haro object. Tell me a little bit about, what that felt like when you came up with it. I mean, how did that?
Okay. What I think is probably getting ahead of itself a little here is that the Herbig-Haro object model that I propose shows the capture of the Saturnian system of planets. All right, and the process of the capture is what produces by basically short-circuiting out the brown dwarf star that would become Saturn, a part of the core. And this is something that I did actually. I had discussions with Wal Thornhill and got a lot of this, from his thinking on the subject matter. A part of the core of Saturn gets spat out because it gets fractured off the core, and that becomes the planet Venus. At the beginning of what you would call the beginning of the capture moment, they go through a process where Venus settles in between Saturn and Mars, and Earth is below in this polar configuration at that time. And I reckon it's about a 6,000 year period where they exist in that polar configuration, Saturn at the top, glowing as a like a fissioning brown dwarf star, burning itself out, scattering water all over the place that become its rings. Venus, this hot core of a piece of Saturn's core, becoming the bright plasma engulfed planet between Mars and and Saturn, and thus producing from an Earth perspective, looking up the famous eye of God, that
Right.
providential eye, that has the back of Saturn with the iris of Venus and the pupil of Mars for the people. So this lasts for a while, and then as the sun as this planetary system becomes more and more dragged into the heliosphere of the sun over a time, and mythology tells us about the distant sun, Helio, and then the growing closer sun over a period of time that sidelights everything and such. The pressure of the sun's much stronger electrical field is what busts up that Saturn, Venus, Mars with Earth below it polar configuration, and creates the cataclysm that's there's the doomsday event that is often referred, in mythology we talk about Atlantis, the fall in the biblical mythologies, the destruction of the Garden of Eden, the end of the Saturnian golden age.
Yes.
And so Venus is a child of Saturn that basically gets severed from, if I remember in the mythologies, it's really messed up if you take it purely as a anthropomorphized sort of story. Venus is a child of Saturn who becomes his bride, who has children, it's a whole incest and all that kind of stuff that you get in this madness of mythology that you see at the time, but makes perfect sense from people observing this in real time.
Right.
As to the breakup of the Saturnian system as it is captured by the much more electrically powerful sun.
Yeah, I've been working on translating the mythology, and it's fascinating. I had a conversation with someone who said, "Look, Bob, these things have been so misinterpreted, they've been so anthropomorphized that it's very difficult for anybody to know what they were talking about." And I completely disagree. If you know that the universe is electric, and on top of that, if you know that there was a cataclysm, if you just apply those two basic principles to the storylines, things very quickly become readable and understandable, from a lot of different perspectives. One of the things I liked about the Venus story is how it actually realigns Venus from being a woman to being a man. The early name of Venus when it was a child was Pallas. Mm-hmm. That's why Earth is often known as Athena the Pallas. Mm-hmm. But Pallas is actually made up of two words, Pal, which is male, and Las, which is female, which is to say that Venus was electric with a magnetic basis. And so if you know what you're looking at and you talk about these things in terms of the definitions of the names, they tell you a lot. One of my favorite ones was Mars. Hey guys, what does Mars do? Well, it Mars things. Doesn't do that today, but when it was named Mars, it would send off electrical discharges, marring the planets around it. Yeah. How did Mars become Mars? It Mars.
Yeah. Well, that chaotic period, the breakup, was probably the most terrifying thing the human species has ever been through.
Oh, the stories are fantastic.
Yeah,
and they're global. The
original capture, what Eduardo Cardona calls the let there be light moment, when Saturn fissions and the opaque plasmasphere is burnt off, that has been encapsulating all these planets under Saturn as it's electrically overloaded by the sun, and suddenly the entire cosmos is revealed to whatever inhabitants are on the Earth. But at the same time, Saturn is this blaring light. They've never had anything like this. And, and from that, of course, humanity learns to calculate time, and that radically changes the human experience. Hence the reason that Saturn is associated with time, is associated, Chronos and so on like that, from previous times. The Greek sort of idea of the name that stood for the same archetype that Saturn is. You get that golden age where humanity discovers the concept of discovery, if you know what I mean. So they suddenly have weights and measures, and they can calculate and do stuff. But there's a time coming in this destructive epoch at the end of the Golden Age that destroys everything. In the stories, it's Zeus assaulting his father Kronos, and getting rid of him to release all the children that Kronos has been cannibalizing, and all these sort of weird and wacky stories that you get from that. I think possibly the one point that everybody must take into account when they approach mythology, Aristotle says this, Cicero has mentioned this, and so on, and that is that when the ancients of those times talked about the gods, they associated the gods with the wandering stars, the planets, the 5 naked eye planets. And so when you read that mythology, it is the planets they are talking about, as Aristotle says as much. And many of them confirm this, and that's the key. You're talking about planetary movements, but because our skies look nothing like mythology describes. Yeah, guys like John J. O'Neill and these Victorian scholars and so on looked out and said, what were these idiots doing talking about Saturn being a sun, being a greater sun, being the sun, and so on like that? They must have been idiots. They couldn't equate the mythological idea of what the planets were doing with what they saw in the world, because they were told that's how it had been for billions of years, certainly before any humans walked on the planet. And so they contrived this idea that that mythology was not referencing the planets.
The idea is that these were just simple, wandering tribes of individuals who over time happen to continue to anthropomorphize ideas. And they don't give credit to the concept that, no, there were knowledgeable people on Earth. I'm not going to put a label on who they were or what they were. We could say they were the Atlanteans or, whatever that was. But the information within the mythology is not random, and it's not minor, nor is it low-level information. I mean, this is very deep information about not only the formation process, but the events that occurred prior to humans ever being around. What
modern scholarship has done is they simply will not listen to the words of mythology, because they have a preconceived idea that the way we see the solar system, Saturn has always been a pinprick of light that where we see very rarely, and until recent times didn't even know it had rings. Now, this is a classic problem. All right, we in the modern world discovered the rings of Saturn, all right, at the time of Galileo. But the god Saturn in mythology is always portrayed as an encircled god. Now, good. Yeah. Okay. So now one of the great, what do you call, missed opportunities that the electric universe and Saturn theorists had was the only other god that has ever been portrayed as an encircled god, with vines around his hips, that kind of stuff, is Jupiter or Zeus. Okay. Now there was a 30, 40 years ago, that should have been an opportunity to say to the world, when we get out to Jupiter, you will find Jupiter has rings like Saturn. All right. We can't see them here. You can hardly see them even if you're, as far close to as Mars is or anything along those lines. But that would have been a predictive coup to have said, if Saturn was portrayed with rings back in ancient times, and we found out only in modern times it actually does have rings, all right, which you can't see with the naked eye, but they knew it had rings, then Jupiter should also have rings because Zeus had it. And lo and behold, within my lifetime, I think it was only one of the Voyager craft or something, discovered that Jupiter has its own set of rings. It has a little gossamer set. Now, if the ancients knew that, there's only two possibilities. They had technology where they could observe this, in which case they would have stopped referring to the 5 planets as the naked eye planets. All right, it would have been done through observations, or Earth and these planets were close enough that these features that can't be seen, rings and so on, were clearly observable to the ancients.
Yes.
Those are the only two options available for their idea.
And, I've tried a number of times to reach out to people in the Greek mythology realm. I actually sent an email to, I think it's some mythology institute. I said, hey, I'd like to speak with someone if you have some time. And, these guys think they already know what's going on. And they, and what they don't realize, and I've just discovered this constantly every time I look at it, is they don't realize that many of these stories are the exact same story about the exact same event told as if someone else was telling it. So it's got the same characters, and it may sound different, but it isn't ultimately different. It's the same story being told from a slightly different perspective in the historical record. And it's not myth. It's
that's why Carl Jung's contributions in terms of archetypes is so essential to the understanding, far beyond anything Freud contributed in terms of understanding the human psyche. We have these archetypes as a collective species ingrained in us, whether we're descended from, African Bantu peoples to the Pacific Island peoples to, Siberian shamanistic nomads, whatever. Everybody has these archetypes, within a system. And, the most powerful archetypes are the creator god who turns nasty, which is the Saturnian or the Saturn god archetype that you see, at the head of virtually all the world religions. We have the doomsday archetype, where this creator god archetype basically turns on his creation, decides I've had enough, I'm getting rid of it. Yeah. Right. And that is the most scarring archetype and the most easily manipulated archetype in terms of making people fear something. This never-ending thing that humanity suffers of, this this fear of a doomsday is going to happen again at some point in time, and it can be manipulated and used. It's so powerful, no matter what race or tribe or clan you come from. It's there in all of us, and this is why mythology. When if you simply reject the idea of mythology as a record of observed events, because the world doesn't look like that today, therefore it couldn't have looked like it back then, right? And so on, you're missing the whole point. You are never going to understand mythology, and that's why in today's world, the whole of mythology is geared towards creating narratives that sort of take the square peg of mythology and they try and bang it into a round narrative, And
that narrative has nothing to do with electricity, and it has nothing to do with the planets being closer.
And we get bad Hollywood movies, and that tell, and everybody goes, "Oh, I know mythology. It's the Titans and it's these guys and a guy riding on a winged horse." And
like the new Marvel movie. They had Zeus show up, and he's up there and he's throwing lightning bolts down. And what I love about the Zeus image of the lightning bolt is that people don't understand is that the thumb in the lightning bolt itself is Zeus showing you the direction of the current.
Absolutely. And
that's exactly what he's doing.
When Anthony Peratt came on the scene in the Electric Universe and talked about the plasma experiments that they were doing at Los Alamos. Yeah. And they were, you can see one of the weirdest things about Zeus, the god of the thunderbolt and so on, is that his thunderbolt doesn't look like forked lightning, all right, which is the way the modern Christian era portrays the thunderbolt of God, all that sort of stuff. It looks like this two-headed fork, all right, that, it's got a three-pronged northern part and a three-pronged southern part, and that's exactly what you get with Z pinches and so on in a plasma laboratory. When they put, plasma under certain electrical stresses. So yes, the planet Jupiter, Zeus, is the god of the thunderbolts, and it corresponds perfectly with what we know about the behavior of plasma when it goes into arc mode.
Yeah, I'm going to share some of these images really quick so that folks know what we're talking about. Some of these images are probably familiar to you, but the one over here on the right-hand side, if you can see that okay?
Sure.
is really sort of a stylized example of the cosmic thunderbolt. There's this center, which is the Z pinch, and then you've got one side of this, which is going to be the positive polarity, and the other side is the negative polarity. And in the middle is that singularity where the Z pinch is, and really the only thing the Z pinch does is determine the direction of current. And this one up here, I went to go show this one, but this one right here is from the EU-27 Cosmic Thunderbolt. These images are all images from archetypical, art that's, very common amongst ancient cultures. All
ancient cultures, not just Mesopotamian or Greek or whatever like that. This is found throughout the world. I mean, the one that you've got up at the moment that shows the classic squatter man sort of image. Okay, that's where I come from, where I was brought up in New Zealand. That's your Maori sort of god of the haka. I don't know if you've ever seen an outfit called the All Blacks playing rugby. They do a sort of war dance.
I haven't, but you and I should get together and talk about
concept. They have that squatter man, as a part of the cultural dance that's done there. That's all derived from observations of plasma in action during a time when the sky was terrifying.
It was. And this is, to me, the replicability of the imagery was one of the things that first drew my attention directly. My superpower, if you will, is similarities, which doesn't seem like much of a superpower. But, when I see these things, I see a high level of similarities amongst these. And I went, wow, this is just incredible, And it's really one of the things that's missing in our education system is, people aren't taught how to use the transitive effect or the transitive property of a similarity, in that, you have these plasma images, and then Dr. Pratt was smart enough to say, hey, Walt Thornhill and Dave Talbot said these are on the walls all over the world, and by God, they are. And so you get this sudden, connection of, hey, mythology and actual plasma event somewhere in time have the same continuity. That is to say, they both occurred. And it's one of the more powerful things about the electric universe, that when I went, okay, so what are they talking about? An electric universe. Hey, here's an actual example of electrical terminology etched into rock.
Absolutely. And it's so scalable as well. You can do it in a lab and see it at almost galactic levels taking place.
Dr. Scott did an EU presentation, and he got up there and he said, the thing that most scientists who look at the electric universe model don't get is that it's scalable. That is to say, what they use in your phone is the exact same scalable model that runs not only the solar system and the galaxy, but the universe. It's all the same principle.
Well, you see, one of the most tragic things I ever heard come from, a mainstream thinker. He's not somebody famous or anything, just a person that I knew who was a scientist in astrophysics and so on, was the statement that, Newton described what happens down here. Einstein described what happens out there, as if it's separate, as if it's a totally separate experience.
And then we look at both of these guys today as if they got it right. And the fact is that Newton didn't get it right. Gravity is not an actual field. The gravitational field is an electrical field. It's my opinion that it is the negative charge, that the thing pulling us is the ground. The negative charge being the ground. There's a negative charge in the center of the Earth. And that negative charge discharges, forming our heliosphere, the electromagnetic field, magnetosphere of the Earth, rather. And the reason we're pulled to the middle of the Earth is that we're pulled to the ground of a circuit.
And it's a variable thing. It's a gravity, they talk about constants all the time, speed of light being a constant, gravity being a constant, and so on like that. But, one of the great contributions that my former partner in writing, Ted Holden, came up with was understanding why you have these mass die-offs in species down through, the fossil record. And there seems to have been from enormity to smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, if you're living on something that is the gravity pull is defined electrically, and that electrical current is messed with by the arrival of other objects, by the arrival of other electrical fields, gravity is going to change. and it's probably going to get heavier if you move into a body like the sun, when before you were under where it was governed by a body like Saturn. You've got this gravitational change, and the big creatures can't handle it. And Ted did a Thunderbolts channel piece on I forget the name of the video, but it was on the inconvenience of gravity and the dinosaurs, the impossible dinosaurs,
the impossible dinosaurs, which he has a book on. And that was another moment where I looked at it and I went, yeah, the Earth had to have gotten larger. The Earth had to have increased its ground potential, if you will, in order for that to happen. Because people go, and if you do that, if you look at the Earth as an expanding object that increases in gravitational in a gravitational mode, you look at things like the surviving mammoth after the cataclysm, right? They were slower, they were few, and they were easy to kill and feed people. So people go, well, they hunted them into extinction. Yeah, they hunted them into extinction because they were slow and they were starving. Yeah, right. And so you really get a sense of how these things happened.
Yeah, and they were coming out of a world where the influence of Saturn's light above, the Arctic was the paradise on Earth once. Yeah. All right. It was the warm water paradise. That's why you find these animals with subtropical food in their stomachs still. The evidence is there. There's still people trying to convince the world that the mammoths went around grubbing with their tusks to try and get liching, materials. First of all, there's no evidence on any of their tusks they find of any wear and tear in doing this. So, that's a bust as far as an idea goes. But, when you are messing with an electrostatic phenomenon that is the root cause of gravity, and it changes when you break the electrical circuits and so on, you are going to have very sudden changes in gravity. I'm somebody, one of my sort of hobby studies are the megalithic buildings of, early human history. And if you are on a planet that is maybe only 60% of the gravity that we currently have now, then lugging those big rocks around is not quite the problem that it is today. That mystifies us. How did they roll those rocks down to the Stonehenge and all this sort of stuff? Right. And we hear lots and lots of explanations for it, but the idea that a lower gravity may have helped out, and a lower gravity in a highly electrostatic environment, and so is probably what these people were negotiating at the time when they were alive. Now, Ted is also in discussions I've had with him and such, we talk about humans living, very long lives in ancient times. There's that part of the record that people say this is ridiculous, it's impossible.
Yeah, 900 years. How did that happen?
Yeah,
the Earth was not 365 days, people.
Well, that's dead right. I mean, some of the claims of 60,000 years, that could have been just simply turns of the rings of Saturn.
There you go.
A day. In other words, 60,000 days is how long they lived, or something like that. But if they have the 360 day of the original biblical figures, all right, before it became 365, according to the biblical record, okay, we can quibble over does somebody live 900 years, but if you don't have the gravitational stress on your physical form that we have today, you will live longer. You will live longer, naturally. Yeah. It's as simple as that. You will not wear and tear down the way we do now. And it's interesting because, man would only live, would be limited to 120 years. In the Bible, it corresponds with the Exodus that Velikovsky said was one of Venus's flybys, a close approach periods. Did the gravity change dramatically at the time of the Exodus to limit, human life to a certain period of time?
All good questions. Troy, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're just at an hour right now, and I got to tell you, I've really enjoyed our conversation here. And down the road sometime, I'd love to have you come back because I think we have a lot of other things we can cover, including the megalithic structures and a lot of ancient history stuff. Do you have any last thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Well, actually, it's not so much last thoughts or anything. One of the things I'm anticipating is talking to you about the Venus connection, particularly with the Tyrrhene Basin that you've postulated in some of your own stuff and so on. Getting a handle on that, because I have a very different take on the biblical take of the flood, as opposed to the cataclysm that brought the days of Eden. The days of Eden to a close, or the Golden Age, and it's all centered, in my thinking, it's all centered around the Tyrrhene Basin.
Well, it is. There were actually two events, and we're kind of at the end of this. There was the original cataclysm of the Earth getting hit, and then there was a second cataclysm, if you will, where the water inundated the Earth. And I'm still working on this. You won't find it in my video, so this is a heads up for everybody. But I found a Ute creation myth, and the Ute creation myth really talks about a binary setup, that is the sun on one side and a second body on the other. One poured earth through the hole and the other poured water through the hole. That's what the Ute creation story myth says. And so my thought is that after the collapse, the water from the water side followed us until it reached us as we reached the helical disc. When we reached the helical disc, the water caught up, and it flooded us until we reached electrical equilibrium, if you will. Yeah. And that's why the oceans stop at that just perfect spot to the continents.
Well, you see, most of my studies are sort of I take people up cosmologically to the great fall of Saturn from its perch, and the world being changed. And from there, I'm more interested in the sociological, political, religious sort of ideas that come out of the mythological record. Guys like Ev Cochran, Dave Tyler, Juno Cook, these kinds of people, they try to plot what happens in terms of the cosmology from that great doomsday period right up to about 500 BC, where before things start actually settling down to what we see today. But I've looked at your Venus stuff, and I'm very interested in it, because there's also a role to be played by the planet Jupiter in all this.
There is, and I'm working on that mythology. So let's get you back on here in a couple of weeks, and maybe 3 or 4 podcasts down the road. I've got some guests lined up, but I'd love to have you back on, and I think you'd be one of the folks that would have a much more intelligent conversation on the subject, because again, like I found your model, you begin in the right place, and you understand that the collapse occurred, and that's where my model begins. Sure. So again, Troy, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate having you on the show, and folks, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a comment in the comment section down below. And again, if you guys have any guest speakers you'd like me to reach out to, or if you'd like to be a speaker on the show, send me an email, drstinky.mcdougall@gmail.com. And with that, everybody have a great week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Peace out.